Thank you for watching ECSO News on Blab TV. I'm Amber Southard. Tonight we have a special edition for you. We interviewed a bunch of veterans that work right here at the Escambia County Sheriff's Office in honor of Veterans Day. We hope you enjoy.
Veterans Day is a day to honor all those who have served before me and after me, and really just to think about without them and without their sacrifices, we wouldn't have the great country we do have. I've always wanted to be in law enforcement. I've always enjoyed helping people and serving others. It is just a natural progression going from a security enforcement to being civilian law enforcement.
My dad was a World War II veteran. My uncles were World War II veterans. Two of my brothers were Vietnam and Gulf War veterans. It means a lot because what the sacrifices veterans make is why we get to live the way that we get to live. I've been a deputy for 20 years. When you come off active duty and you go into the civilian community, you're looking for the camaraderie that you had when you were in the military, and the sheriff's office or law enforcement gives you the camaraderie, and you get to work with people and you get to be a lot closer and a lot tighter. So you look for that. If I could go back in and do it again, I'd leave tomorrow. Except for taking care of my kids, I would leave tomorrow. I love it. Loved every minute of it. It was a good time, great experience. Got to go to a lot of places, see a lot of things, and meet a lot of people. Great life. It was a great life.
Well, it means freedom that's paid for by veterans. Without those veterans out there fighting our wars for us and fighting for our freedoms, we wouldn't have those freedoms. Having gone overseas and seeing how other countries treat their citizens, it gives you a little bit of respect as to what we actually have here as freedoms.
It seems like you never lose it as far as being part of that family, and I see that here with law enforcement also.
Veterans Day is a day for us to remember those that we lost overseas and to show respect to the ones that we still have. I'm a member of the VFW, and we have something called Red Shirt Fridays, where we all wear red shirts until all of our brothers and sisters come home.
Veterans Day personally for me, I mean, it's just about sacrifice and service to your country, and it's also a time that we can remember the people that have served and stepped up and answered the call of our nation, and it's just a really proud day for me. Considering I do something now different than what I was doing at service, going into a semi-military, paramilitary environment was actually an easy transition for me. So my ability to understand rank structure, order, discipline, rules, translated very easily to my performance here. It's a very important thing to be able to serve your country. I think everybody should be required to do it. But those who do it without being mandated to do it, that's a special breed.
Veterans Day means sacrifice, honor, and kind of remembering those that serve currently and those that have served. I was in the U.S. Air Force. I served from 1994 to 1998. I was stationed at Hurlburt Field, which is in Fort Walton Beach, and I was a crew chief. I worked on the Combat Talon II, and at the time it was the top-of-the-line aircraft, brand new. It was the U-model gunship.
Well, now that I'm a civilian, it's totally different than when I was in. When I was in, it was just really wasn't much of a different day. Most of the time I was working anyways, and we'd have a luncheon or maybe a parade. But now that I'm a civilian, I look at it a little differently. I reflect on who I was stationed with and what I did and where I was and the people that have died for us having freedoms. And I've lost people, and it's just a day of remembrance for me.
I went in right after high school, 1986. I'd actually signed up the summer before my senior year. A friend of mine had gone to join the Navy, and he took me with him, and the next thing I know, I ended up joining the Army. I'm not sure how that worked out, but I did. And I drove tanks. I was an armor crewman for, back in the 80s, you could sign up for a 2-year enlistment. So I did 2 years in the Army, and I got money for college, and I used it to go to school and figure out what I wanted to do with my life.
Veterans Day to me means that it's about sacrifice. It's about honoring the sacrifice of those who serve, whether they served and they died, or they served and they sacrificed by losing limbs or parts of their body, or just the people that are suffering with PTSD. There's so many different ways that they've sacrificed, and also the families. So many people don't think about that as well, because I've had the unique opportunity to be on both sides. I was military deployed, left my family, and then my husband deployed and left us and went on many deployments after 9/11, and so I got to be on both sides of it. So veterans sacrifice, their families sacrifice, everyone's in it sacrifices because there's something more important, and you want to be a part of that, and to be able to have that freedom, to be able to say what you want to say, and be able for people to vote. And it's just such an important thing. So for me, it was the best time of my life. I had some hard times in there, but I just look at all the great memories and the fun things I did and the silly things that you did with it, but it was just such a good thing for me. It was one of the best things I ever did in my life.
My veteran experience started at the ripe old age of 18. I had just turned 18, and I enlisted in the United States Air Force. I was just a couple months after attending one semester in college. I actually graduated from high school when I was 17. Went to college for a semester and decided that I didn't have enough money to go, and I'd always wanted to be in police work. Well, at that age, of course, I couldn't be hired as a civilian police officer, and so my alternative was to go and be a military police officer. They didn't have the restrictions; you had to be 21, and so that was my initial reason for enlisting in the service. But it was also, a strong sense of community and nation that had been instilled in me by my grandparents and my parents, and a very influential man in my life whose name was Calvin Richardson, who was a World War II bomber pilot. He was an instructor pilot first, and then near the end of the war he was with the 8th Air Force, and of course that was part of the bombing of Germany under later General Curtis E. LeMay, who basically perfected low-level saturation bombing, which led to the conclusion of the war with, of course, Nazi Germany and later Imperial Japan. And by a strong sense of duty and honor and country, I think probably came from Mr. Richardson more than anything else. And he had a pretty simple and basic philosophy. Of course, the Vietnam War was going on at that time, a very unpopular war in the United States, as I graduated high school in 1970. And so as a young man, you have those conflicts, what popular society and culture is telling you is appropriate, and then what those who grew up, during the war years, because I was a war baby, meaning I was born, after World War II. And so you had a little bit of almost a dysfunctional reasoning, because so many of those things that were tradition, we saw going by the wayside, that it was no longer in vogue or popular to be patriotic, and there were many who would denigrate you, for taking that approach. Well, obviously that didn't work on me because I felt an obligation, and so to become a military police officer, and of course the benefits from entering the military was, GI Bill benefits. So as a young enlisted member, I started attending college because now I had the money to go, and also the military paid for my education. You had to make above a C for them to pay a certain amount. And so I'd completed almost 2 years of college at the end of my first enlistment, and decided that, I think I'll stay in the military and I'll make it a career. So I returned to Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and finished my bachelor's degree in criminal justice on the GI Bill, and then later completed a master's in business administration through Webster's University. So, the military was very good to me. It paid for all of my education, gave me an opportunity to see the world, to serve with other like-minded young men and women, and to also see a lot of changes in the military that have affected my ability, I think, to be the sheriff of Escambia County. The Air Force was the first military service to admit women into law enforcement. And oddly enough, it started with the canine program. We actually let women train as canine handlers, was the first group. And then in 1973, I reported to Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota in January of 1974. We had the first group of female law enforcement officers that that were assigned to Ellsworth Air Force Base. And so we went through those pangs of integration, if you will, on, are women suited for law enforcement? So many of the things that later our civilian counterparts went through, we had already gone through in the military in opening and integrating, those law enforcement functions to women. And of course we found out very quickly that, there were some physiological issues that we had to work through, upper body strength, those sorts of issues. But the Air Force always took the approach of, how do we integrate and make this work, to the safety and security of the unit as a whole. So, do we have to change training procedures? Do we have to leaven that field for women, and how can we use technology to do that? And so I think the Air Force was always on the leading edge of bringing women into law enforcement. And so I finished my first tour of duty enlisted. I was an E5 staff sergeant when I finally mustered out and went back to college. And then I chose to retire when first eligible. As a major in the Air Force, which is an 04, I could have stayed for 23 years, but I was ready to move on. I was ready to, I'd always wanted to start a business later in my career. I was thinking about what am I going to do when this first part of my life is over. This chapter is finished. And so we chose to move to Pensacola, to Escambia County. I finished my last tour of duty at Eglin Air Force Base in Fort Walton Beach. And so we moved over here and started a couple of businesses, a private investigative business. I worked a lot of criminal cases, sex crimes, homicides, that sort of thing. And then some, white collar crime, a lot of large scale fraud cases and that sort of thing. I had an opportunity to work with some investigators at the Pensacola Police Department, a few on the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, but not many. And then of course, met many of the folks that work at the State Attorney's Office while I was in private practice. And many times I was a court-appointed investigator, which meant that I had access to NCIC and all of those things that a fully commissioned officer has on the PPD of the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. And so, that background and training, probably in the leadership side, was the most important thing. You live or die by your ability to lead in the military. You have to complete what's called professional military education, PME. And then for the Air Force, that's Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff College, and eventually Air War College if you stay long enough to remain, which my wife did. I had completed SOS, which is Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff College, which was up through the rank that I held at that time. In order to go to Air War College, you had to be an 05 or above, and of course my wife retired as a full colonel in 06, and of course she completed all of those schools, and she stayed almost 28 years. I retired when first eligible right at the 20-year point because I chose to go on and do some other things. So we both had very successful careers, I think, in the Air Force. Very proud of my military service. And again, all of that leadership training and management has certainly greatly benefited me as the Sheriff of Escambia County. What does it mean to be a veteran? Gosh, you're a member of the largest fraternity and sorority in the world. You can go to any locale and almost always there's someone there that's a veteran, and so you have an immediate connection with that person, whether it's a male or a female, because of your shared experiences. All veterans go through some form of basic military training. We always kind of laugh in the Air Force that one of the distinctions between the Air Force and the other services is everybody in the Army and the Marine Corps are basic infantry officers or infantry men or women. You're taught basic rifleman courses, etc. And in the Navy, for those that don't know, everybody's a fireman in the Navy. Why? Because a fire aboard ship is a very serious thing. We don't have that commonality in the Air Force. Not everybody flies. So there isn't really a thing in the Air Force that we all kind of have a touchstone with. So the Air Force tends to be a little more disjointed than the other services. But I would tell you that the veteran bond is the same regardless. And so, was proud to retire as an Air Force officer, would do it all again. And I just, have a sense of pride when we go to veterans events and organizations. And I'm always in awe, especially of the World War II and Korean veterans and Vietnam veterans. Why? Because I was during the Vietnam era, was never assigned in country. My first assignment was to Alaska, did a couple of years there, and then when I rotated out of Alaska, the war was winding down in 1973. The closest I came to going to Vietnam was when they mined the harbors of Haiphong. Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State at that time, and we were driving, the Viet Cong to the peace table in Paris, and we were, doing alerts where you'd load up and get on an airplane, and we were going to end up flying to Yokota, Japan, and from there deployment on into Vietnam. and actually loaded up on that airplane a couple of times and took off. But you know, we were called back, which is a kind of an old common military joke about hurry up and wait. But that was about the closest I come to, you know, serving in country. But I would tell you, I had an opportunity to do a couple of presentations honoring some of the survivors of Pearl Harbor here in Escambia County. Had an opportunity, again, because of my military background and career, to go to Normandy and to walk through the cemetery there. For those of you who haven't been, the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan are filmed at the Normandy beaches, and it was actually filmed there where you have the acres of crosses with the Star of David on them, you know, for those. And many of those markers, you know, say, you know, a comrade in arms known only to God, because they only had remains that they could bury that were unidentifiable. So those are things, I think, as a veteran, that you ask yourself, you know, would I have had the courage to do what those men did that morning? Because when you stand on that hill and look at the beach, there's areas that are 100 to 200 yards away. And so when the landing craft hit the beach, you had to clear to that beach to get to any, you know, part of safety. And all the machine gun emplacements were set up by the Germans in the pillboxes, and they had intersecting fields of fire, and they were referred to as, you know, the killing fields or the killing zones. And so to have the courage to come off of that LST and make that 100 yards or 200 yard run, you know, took a tremendous amount of courage. And so I think all veterans see that and they're just in awe. And so to have had an opportunity to meet our Pearl Harbor survivors here in Escambia County, you know, you're standing in the presence of greatness. You know, people who literally paid ultimate sacrifices for the freedom that we deserve today. I think far too many times those in elected office forget that the price that was paid for you to be allowed to go on television or before a community and say the things that you feel are necessary to say were paid for by those people that went before us. And so that's the history that we have as veterans. It's something that is immeasurable, and you can't put a price on that. Honored to serve. Judy's question was about the distinction or the difference between the Escambia County Sheriff's Office and the Pensacola Police Department. Judy, I'll try to step through this and not confuse you too much, because I get this question with some regularity. There is no statutory requirement, meaning no law, that requires that you have a police department. A police department is formed, the rules and regulations are set up in accordance with the criminal justice training standards within the state of Florida, and usually it's a city administrator and or mayor and city council that say, hey, we want to hire a chief of police and create a police department. But there's no statutory requirement for that, meaning that today, conceivably, the mayor of Pensacola could call a council meeting and say, we can't afford the Pensacola Police Department anymore, and they would quite literally go away, and that can't be stopped. It's a vote of the local elected officials. My office, the office of sheriff, is in the Florida Constitution. That's why they refer to us as constitutional officers. I am a duly elected constitutional officer in the state of Florida. And so for a 4-year term, I would be the sheriff of Escambia County. Statutorily, you must have a sheriff in every county within the state of Florida. There's one exception with all sheriffs being elected. There's 67 counties in Florida. There's one appointed sheriff, and that's in Miami-Dade. They are a consolidated government. And the Board of County Commissioners appoints a sheriff down there, much like they appoint a chief of police. But even then, they have to have a sitting sheriff always on duty. I am what's referred to as the Chief Constitutional Law Enforcement Office for the county. So another distinction between the Escambia County Sheriff's Office and the Pensacola Police Department is my jurisdiction is everywhere, meaning that the city is within the county, and anything within the county comes under my authority or purview as the elected sheriff of Escambia County. That is not true with the Pensacola Police Department. Their jurisdiction or boundaries are specifically set by the city limits of Pensacola. They also run the Pensacola Airport Police, but outside of those parameters, their authority ends. Now what we do, because we have a wonderful working relationship with the Pensacola Police Department, is I normally commission about 30 officers per year at the Pensacola Police Department. So they carry a dual commission. They're not only Pensacola police officers, they're also Escambia County deputies. The reason why we do that is to expand their jurisdiction, meaning that let's say there was a burglary that was committed in the city of Pensacola by an Escambia County resident. In order to ease that process, when the investigators at the Pensacola Police Department look at that case and develop a suspect and want to go out and interview or serve a warrant on the suspect in the county, they couldn't do that unless they were, again, commissioned by me as the sheriff of Escambia County. So that's where their authority extends past the city limits. But that's probably the most clear distinctions between the two. Again, I'm required by Florida law to be a sheriff in Escambia County. There is no requirement for a police department to be established. Some citizens wrote in and kind of asked a general question as to what do we think are the most important traits or attributes that we look for in young men and women that want to come into law enforcement. And again, the first things that come to mind is, tolerance, having a sense of humor, being compassionate, that sort of thing. But probably the answer, I think, that probably most accurately describes what we're looking for as agency heads, and I'm speaking of myself and other Florida sheriffs and other chiefs of police throughout the nation, was back my first year in office. We had a block of instruction at the Florida Sheriff's Academy, and the subject was character versus competence. And it was, again, the subject basically was, what are we looking for in young men and women that decide that they want a career in law enforcement? And so they kind of synthesized this thing down to answer your question, and it was about character. Because competence can be taught to anyone of reasonable intelligence. We can, teach you, basic ticket writing 101 or traffic stops, or, how to handle a domestic violence situation. All of those things can be very mechanical, meaning that we're going to teach you the elements of the law, officer safety, citizen contact, etc. But what we cannot teach to someone who is devoid of it or who hasn't been taught that from their very early learning experiences is that thing called character. Do you know the difference between right and wrong? Or is it something that we have to prod you or remind you of? And as silly as it may sound in today's society, and it started way back in the 60s with something that became in vogue, which was called situational ethics. And it revolved around the basic question of, when is it okay to lie? And so situational ethics, this whole field in the area of psychology, was brought up about, to save my life or to save someone else's life, I think I could probably lie to get out of that. And while those are instances in the extreme under great moral duress, it's kind of been extrapolated out now to, maybe to get my way would be okay. Or if I'm going to hurt or harm someone's feelings, it would be okay to lie in this circumstance. And so quite obviously, we lose our morality and our character and our integrity by degrading it. It's a series of degradations that go down and we kind of mainstream it's okay to lie. An example is today in the area of employment, most employers will tell you that they throw out about 65 to 70% of what's in your resume because it's creative writing. A whole industry sprung up several years ago of resume writing, to where I take the most mundane or simplest of things and I kind of expand on that to where, I've got you walking on water and, feeding the multitudes with a few pieces of bread and some fish, and, raising the sick and, healing, or raising the dead and healing the sick. And so we all kind of read those and kind of give it a big ho-hum. But it is difficult for some people to basically say yes or no, or what to see and define what is right and what is wrong. And that's that thing we call character. And so we look for that in young men and women today through our testing process and through the background investigation, through the polygraph exam. Do you know the difference between right and wrong? And so character is probably the thing that we look the most for those who want to come into the area of law enforcement. Why? Because your safety and the security of our community and our nation depends upon men and women who know the difference between the two. Randy asked the questions, when and how and why are curfews implemented during hurricanes? By Florida statute, Randy, what occurs is when we're in the midst of a hurricane or some sort of natural disaster, or we could have a riot or an insurrection. The Board of County Commissioners will meet, and what they do is in emergency operations, the running of the county during the term of the emergency is turned over to 2 people. For administration, it's turned over to the county administrator. In that case today, it's Mr. Jack Brown. And for, again, law enforcement operations, it's the sheriff of Escambia County. And so during emergency operations, the county is being, in essence, ran by 2 people, Jack Brown and Sheriff David Morgan. Now, what we do in those instances, Jack handles all the emergency operations side, and of course, quite obviously, we handle that. Dependent upon the breadth and depth of the destruction that's occurred and for the safety of the community at large, and of course, in the most extreme cases, you know, the governor can intervene when they declare a natural disaster area and call in, you know, the National Guard within the state of Florida, which has happened in different instances. In consultations with the governor and his staff, the attorney general, and then locally here, they may do a curfew through the governor's office, or we can implement a curfew here in Escambia County, and that's for the safety and security of the citizens, meaning that we have gas lines that haven't been secured, we have power lines that are down, there's a great or high potential for looting because people have evacuated areas and now their possessions are basically strewn all over the countryside. And so in order to prevent that, you know, level of mayhem, if you will, we may determine, you know, that there's a curfew from the time, you know, from sunset to sunrise, and people are not allowed on the streets. Why? Because that's to clear the streets of personnel and to allow law enforcement free and unfettered access to secure our community. So those determinations are made collectively as to, you know, the times when they should be implemented and actually what parts of the county they may have. We may actually have the north end, you know, north of 9 Mile or south of 9 Mile, depending upon where the disaster is. So there's a very deliberative process that has to pass, you know, some legal muster, if you will, to determine, you know, again, the breadth and depth of the curfew and its enforceability. Why? Because, you know, we always, you know, forecast and look to the future for potential lawsuits, because no matter how well-intentioned we are and how well we perform our duties, you know, we'll be sued by somebody. And so I can tell you that curfews, you know, go through a winding process, but when they're implemented, it's for the safety and security of our community. Remember, you can also email your questions and ask the sheriff at escambiaso.com. We'll be back next week right here on Blab TV, Tuesday night at 8 p.m.